Good afternoon. We thank you all for joining us today. We're so excited to have you here on this exciting topic. We're going to allow just a few more seconds to go by and allow all of our attendees a chance to get plugged in. Please note that today's session will be recorded and available to you via a recording link. It will be sent to you via email and also available on our Southern Regional Education Board website. If at any time during today's session you have a question or technical difficulties, please use the chat box. You can also submit your questions using the Q&A feature. We'll do our best to answer all the questions that come in, but depending on time, we may wait until the end to address those questions. With that said, we thank you again, and I'll pass it to Dr. Lawrence.
Good afternoon. I am Stevie Lawrence, and I serve as Vice President for Post-Secondary Education at the Southern Regional Education Board. And we are very delighted that you are able to join us this afternoon. And we're grateful for our colleagues at Huron for participating and partnering with SREB as we work to help higher education institutions emerge stronger during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, colleges and universities are always addressing new challenges. These have been exacerbated by the pandemic. This session has been designed to help structure administrative services to maximize resources, to invest more in academics, in research, of course, with students, and more community outreach contributions toward the missions of each of those topics in higher education. Our guests this afternoon are both employees of the University System of Georgia. Joining us is Dr. John Fuchko, who serves as Vice Chancellor for Organizational Effectiveness Administration, as well as his colleague, Dr. Juanita Hicks, who is the Vice Chancellor for Human Resources at USG. Also joining them is Chris Byrne, who serves as a Director at Huron Consulting. And we are again pleased that they are joining us this afternoon to share insight about administrative efficiencies and how they help enhance the overall university mission. With that, again, I welcome you, and I would like to turn it over now to our colleagues for this afternoon's presentation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for that introduction. I will go ahead and get started with the content of today's meeting. So I believe we just covered introductions, so thank you for that. We'll go ahead and kick things off really with an overview of organizational efficiency and effectiveness. What does that mean in a higher education context, and why is it important? From there, we're going to spend the bulk of our time on some case studies of where we've seen efficiency initiatives stood up and implemented in practice across the higher ed industry, and really looking forward to hearing from our colleagues at the University System of Georgia to talk about some specific initiatives they have stood up recently and have underway today. We'll briefly touch on some considerations moving forward. And lastly, we'll hold some time for some Q&A and group discussion if there are any questions as we move through the materials. All right, so I'll begin. I'll rehash a few of Dr. Lawrence's points, but quickly want to talk about the impetus for efficiency initiatives. Colleges and universities have been conducting these for years, but there's certainly been an acceleration of this activity in the last 12 months. That said, there have been long-standing trends that have forced institutions to really consider how they can operate more cost effectively in an increasingly competitive environment. There are well-known demographic declines happening across the country. There's increasing student price sensitivity, which is contributing to rising discount rates, and in turn declining net tuition revenue. At the same time, in many states and many regions, we're seeing declining appropriations. So this is all really, in recent years, placed a lot of pressure on colleges and universities to think about how they can deliver more cost effectively. Fast forward, or I guess rewind really 12 months, And we have a global pandemic upon us, which exacerbated all those existing challenges, but also presented new ones. We saw tremendous loss of auxiliary revenue, housing, dining, athletics. We saw institutions forced to offer additional discounts to get students in the door. By and large, there were enrollment declines across the industry. There were certain segments that did not experience this as strongly as others, but in aggregate, certainly enrollment declines and additional lost revenue. And then on the cost side, just to safely reopen, to implement testing, these activities really cost a great deal of money and resources and time and energy, and placed increasing financial pressure on the institutions. And then looking forward, we anticipate a lot of lasting outcomes. We suspect the higher education operating model, may never change 100% back to exactly what it was pre-pandemic. So colleges and universities are starting to think about what can they do to get out in front of this and be really effective moving forward and lasting. Is the remote work and academic delivery model one that's going to last in some capacity in the future? To some degree, most likely it will. And how do we think about structuring the organization around that? Effectively, it all does boil down to what can we do to ensure our students are getting the greatest value for their money and the greatest experience they can while attending an institution. And there's all kinds of administrative efficiency exercises that can be undertaken to provide resources to help ensure those outcomes. These can be big transformational changes, but these can also be fairly typical efficiency efforts, things like procurement strategies. What can we do to get better pricing on our goods and services? It can be about outsourcing selected services where a third-party firm may be able to deliver better service and more cost-effective service than managing in-house operations. It can be about org restructuring or centralization of services, or it could be about shared services models, which we're seeing implemented more frequently. And in some instances, actually across multiple institutions beginning to share resources. So that's all to say, there have been long-standing reasons why colleges and universities have elected to implement efficiency initiatives, and they have been accelerated by the pandemic and the uncertainty with which the future might look. So with that said, I did want to sort of kick things off with a poll question just to see where the audience today is at around administrative efficiency efforts. So we'd like to know if you have implemented any in recent years, which were most successfully implemented at your institution? Do they pertain to procurement and pricing, outsourcing, organizational restructuring, or none of these options that we've presented here? Would love to get a flavor for what the audience has worked on of late. Okay, very interesting results. A lot of organizational restructuring and centralization. And I think if this question had been asked maybe 3 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago, we probably wouldn't see that as the largest response. It's been increasingly utilized as a means of reducing costs and finding resources to invest in the mission. So it makes sense that we would see that as the most common response here. Outsourcing, certainly a successful initiative that can be undertaken, but in many instances, those changes were made further out. And procurement, certainly a great area to focus to achieve cost savings and grow margins. So appreciate seeing that response as well. But organizational restructuring, centralization, certainly we're seeing that more and more frequently out in the market. And as you're all well aware, personnel is the biggest expense lever we can look at. So it makes sense that that's being prioritized of late. All right, so before we dive into some case studies, I wanted to take a quick step back and really kind of define what organizational effectiveness and organizational efficiency mean. So effectiveness refers to the ability for an institution to achieve its strategic objectives in a sustained way. So this is really about actually results. And when you increase effectiveness, you accelerate or elevate the achievement of those results. Efficiency, on the other hand, is the ability for an organization to achieve those results with the same or fewer resources. And this might mean achieving scale or reducing waste in business processes. Ultimately, it's about reducing the cost per unit of output. So how can we grow those results while holding resources steady or growing resources more slowly than the results are increasing? So increased effectiveness doesn't always mean lower costs. However, these concepts are not completely independent. For instance, a stronger focus on efficiency almost always frees up resources to invest in strategic priorities, which would in turn improve effectiveness. And on the other hand, while not always the case, a focus on effectiveness usually results in reduced time, effort, and cost, which tends to occur through better alignment of investments with outcomes and output, faster decision-making, less time and effort meeting and moving information around, and more dedicated to actually getting things done, less rework and duplication of institutional effort, and a fuller utilization of assets, skills, and knowledge. So I want to introduce the concept of the operating model within higher education and sort of its four main components. So we frame organizational effectiveness around these four aspects. We look at this as a holistic view of how an institution works and believe that understanding these elements is critical in successfully implementing an efficiency initiative, which necessarily tend to touch on all these elements of the operating model. So I'll just move through them quickly. So the organizational structure is, how we define and organize our work and accountability. Management processes refer to how we define priorities, make decisions, allocate resources, and coordinate action. Goals and metrics refer to how we set objectives, define and measure success, and also create incentives for improved effectiveness and performance. And then lastly, leadership and culture is about how we shape and model beliefs, behavior, and norms. And any efficiency or effectiveness initiative, as I mentioned, is going to touch on all of these elements. And these are all interconnected. So while it's a comprehensive framework, I do want to clarify that I don't mean to suggest if you're trying to make change that all of these things need to be addressed all at once. Instead, it's more important to identify that these elements have interdependencies with one another. So how does our organizational structure impact our decision-making, for instance? How does the way we set goals allow us to hold people accountable to actually drive results and change behaviors? And how does culture shape the way we might set priorities and encourage thinking about doing things differently, breaking the status quo? And in some cases, the links are very strong dependencies. One example that comes to mind is that, if we're looking at organizational redesign, centralizing administrative resources, reducing costs, this might require a change in the way we actually build our budgets and allocate resources. So very close interdependencies in many instances. And then lastly, before moving on to some case studies, I wanted to provide a quick illustration of financially why these initiatives are important. So I'll quickly walk you through this chart on the left-hand side of the slide. I recognize there's a lot going on here, so I'll try to simplify it as best I can. But effectively, what we're looking at here is the margins of a hypothetical university with a $100 million operating budget. And the yellow bars reflect its sort of status quo margins. It operates at about a 1% margin, and it grows at 2% a year. So in this status quo environment, over the course of 10 years, that institution generated $12.6 million in margin that could be invested in strategic initiatives, in academic priorities, research, community initiatives, et cetera. What the gray bars show here is an institution that, with the same budget, with the same growth rate, that took a comprehensive efficiency assessment seriously and implemented many recommendations. In many cases, we often see somewhere between 5 and 10% of the university's budget identified for financial impact, savings or cost reduction, or revenue growth. And so really what this translates to over a 10-year period is significantly higher margins year over year. And again, with that 2% growth rate, we see those increase more significantly than the institution at the 1% margin. And we're talking about $81 million over 10 years versus 12.6, significantly more resources to invest in those important mission activities like scholarship and financial aid, tenure track faculty, research initiatives, new academic programs, deferred maintenance, really whatever the laundry list of strategic priorities might be for an institution. Again, I'll stress this is illustrative, but we do see these types of margins achieved at institutions that undertake comprehensive efficiency initiatives. So wanted to present this example just to maybe get the gears turning in folks' heads. All right. So now move on to some case studies. I'm going to quickly move through one that uses this operating model framework, which I've introduced, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues from the University System of Georgia. So this was an engagement I actually worked on personally, so wanted to share what was executed and achieved. But Huron was engaged by a large research institution to help address its operating deficit. And really to assist in breaking down campus silos that existed. So there were a few different campuses that effectively operated as their own institutions with duplicative administrative structures, with duplicative systems, processes, people, you name it. So we were asked to take this holistic view, and I'll touch on what the activities for each of the elements of the operating model were. So on organizational structure, we really looked at management structures, titles, the way work was actually executed and people were managed, and looked for opportunities to restructure accordingly. On management processes, we looked at how are positions actually filled, how are folks hired, and is this contributing to excess of personnel costs? We also looked at the way capital budgeting and projects were prioritized, initiated, and stood up. With respect to goals and metrics, we built models to analyze service levels of the various units, IT, HR, finance, et cetera, what they cost and the services were provided, and how aligned or not aligned they might have been. And then lastly, on leadership and culture, we really worked with the institution's leadership to identify the drivers of that very siloed approach, historic approach to management, what contributed to it, and how might it be resolved. So it was a very comprehensive, holistic assessment of the institution. These were some of the many actions that were undertaken. Again, the goal was to break those silos down, have a more centralized management and service delivery structure, and address the operating deficit. So what actually happened? Organizationally, we saw significant unit by unit restructuring, and actually personnel savings in excess of $25 million were achieved. On management processes, we saw improved position control to limit hiring and to help lock in those personnel savings, make sure the budgets didn't increase, and whittle away at those resources that could be invested in academics. And concurrently increased the appetite for actually shared administrative services. And there are those change initiatives underway currently. Finance and communications are being centralized in efforts that are ongoing today. On goals and metrics, we helped stand up consistent and ongoing monitoring of financial performance across the units, and built models that improve transparency and insight into unit level financials. And then lastly, on leadership and culture, the leaders of those 4 campuses, those silos I had mentioned, now meet weekly and try to take a much more intentional and deliberate enterprise view of institutional success, and also hold each other and their people accountable for that performance, and contributing to the university's success, not their specific silos. So I know I moved through that fairly quickly, but did want to present one example related to the operating model that I had introduced previously. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to John and Juanita to talk through some specific initiatives at the University System of Georgia.
Thank you, Chris. And so it was interesting to hear and see you walk through the operating model, because what we want to share with you, there are many tenets that we identify closely with and have used as we walk through some opportunities within the University System of Georgia. So as it's been introduced, John and I are both a part of the leadership team in the University System of Georgia. John is actually going to walk through the first 2 because they sourced from our comprehensive administrative review project, which was a few years ago in partnership with Huron. And he was the lead on that effort, which walked us through looking at our administrative services from an efficiency and effectiveness approach to see where we may have some opportunities to reinvest any savings or optimization opportunities back towards our students. And then I will come back to look at number 3. But I've been within the university system office for 2 years. Previous to that, I worked on 2 of our campuses, and I got the unique opportunity to walk through these objectives and outcomes from both sides, if you will. So while John will talk about it from a USG perspective, I'll fill in a little bit in a moment from a campus perspective. So John?
Great, thank you, Juanita, and thanks to Huron and SREB for this opportunity. I wanted to start by maybe putting this in a little bit of context. So the Chancellor Wrigley, when he started in his role, he really had 2 primary initiatives that he started with. And one of those was the Comprehensive Administrative Review. The other one was College 2025. And so the College 2025 was really more focused on the academic kind of enterprise and across all of our institutions with that respect. The CAR, when we called it the CAR, the Comprehensive Administrative Review, so CAR is what it became known as after that, really was focused on administrative efficiency. So 2 kind of two thrusts there, 2 prongs for his initial focus. One of the things I'll mention kind of it is the collaborative nature of what was done. And I think this is important just to understand that these things don't happen because they're a good idea. They happen because they're a good idea and they are approached in the right way. And so part of that, at the very beginning of this, there was a steering committee that was set up. Dr. Hicks was a component part of that, as well as her president, who is Dr. Kyle Marrero. He was president of the University of West Georgia at the time. He's since moved to Georgia Southern. And Dr. Marrero was the chair of this steering committee, and we had student representation, faculty representation, staff representation, just a great group of people across our institutions representing all of those areas. Dr. Marrero and I had the opportunity to go out to pretty much all of our campuses and do town halls along with their leadership to really explain this process. So there was a lot of background that went into this. And I can't really reinforce the importance of that because these things can be scary to employees, to faculty, to staff. They can generate a lot of good interest or not, right? And so setting the stage correctly was really important, and I think we did that. Another piece I want to mention before we get into just the kind of the specifics that were listed was kind of the partnership piece to this. And so obviously we had Huron that actually helped us with this process. There was just a ton of data collection and visiting that they did out on our campuses. metrics that they were able to pull. That was all very useful as a part of this process. And frankly, is not something we could have done ourselves internally, absent a huge staff working on this full time, which wouldn't have been very efficient. We also, for those of you who might be thinking of replicating something like this in the future, we did not build a huge team to work on it, right? So we had a gentleman, Dan Ebersol, who worked for us part-time on this for about a year and a half or so, maybe 2 years. And then initially we had Ethan Stiles and later Avery Hart, who really dedicated about probably half of their time, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, to supporting it, and then me. And that was really at the steering level. It was really the partnership with Huron, and then the great partnership we had with our campuses that allowed us to do it without just pouring a ton of additional people onto this at the system level. So in terms of some of what we saw, and in kind of what would happen in this process is any given campus is going to get three things. They're going to get an activity analysis that says this is how people spend their time. They're going to get some benchmarks, and then they're going to get kind of a strengths, weaknesses, sort of survey results where students, faculty, staff, community members were able to say, hey, this is what we think works well on campus and what we think does not. Out of that, and this was different than I think probably Huron had maybe done in some other places, but we were very specific with Huron. We want our campuses to own how they implement this. We don't want to be in a situation where we've got some really great ideas, but they don't buy into them and they can't implement them on their campus. And so Huron was really very helpful in kind of setting a stage and setting a context, but then each campus set up its own team to then say, well, what are we going to do with this and how are we going to change it? And that first bullet, that centralization piece was a big piece of what was done and was a consistent theme across a lot of our campuses, particularly larger institutions. And what does that really mean? Historically, I think sometimes, particularly in our academic units, but across our campuses, there can be a real temptation that if you see something that you think it doesn't work, or it doesn't work the way you think it ought to, and let's say you're the dean of a college, and you're going through some sort of IT support, right? And let's say central IT isn't doing what you think they ought to be doing. So when you get your next budget request that you get to submit, what do you put on there? You put an IT professional, right, that you want to hire, who's going to work for you as the dean and is going to go in there and fix stuff that needs to be fixed for you in your college, rather than forcing the issue centrally to make sure that the central IT can fix whatever it is that you think ought to be addressed. That sort of response, if you will, was something that I'm sure none of you have seen outside of the university system of Georgia, but at least in our situation, in our experience, we saw those tendencies kind of popping up a lot. And we saw it because in that activity analysis, even if the job title didn't say IT, you'd see they're spending 90% of their time doing IT. So we looked at IT, HR was another area, and then business, the finance type functions. And recognize, particularly in the business piece, that some of the colleges within our universities, the size-wise, they need some of that from a budgetary planning perspective. But then there's other areas, and particularly HR and to a large extent IT, that a lot of what was going on there were just centralized activities that they were replicating within a college that wasn't always working the way it ought to be. And oh, by the way, the quality wasn't always what it was supposed to be. And the example, and Dr. Hicks will appreciate this, and she's heard me use it before, is you would get somebody as kind of your HR person, and before you knew it, they were kind of doing their own hiring process, and it wasn't aligned with how payroll was actually done at the campus. It probably wasn't up to date with all of the compliance requirements, whether federal or state or what have you, and it wasn't using the processes that the institution had invested in. And so somebody would get hired, or they thought they were hired, and the dean thought they were hired, and then they discover that they weren't 30 days when they didn't get their first paycheck. And central HR is saying, we don't even know who this person is. What are they doing on campus, right? And so it creates lots of issues. And we said, you know what, this is one of those things that we need to find a way to address. And each campus is going to look a little different, but you need to take a look at this. And so I would say, once again, most of our campuses all had something like this, but particularly our larger institutions really did move to not only centralize some of those activities, but also where those centralized activities had some weak points, to have a deliberate way of working on those, right? Because the last thing you want to do is say, we're taking away the person who's going to help you with it at your college level or your department, but we still have an issue, a process issue, whatever it might be at the central level that hasn't been fixed. So it's a both and that had to be addressed. Within that context, I'll tell you, across the university system, we had close to $114 million that was recognized as savings and ultimately impacted over 800 positions in the university system across all of our campuses. Now, I will say one of the things that they got to do, and this kind of leads into this next area, is the reinvestment of that, right? And so our first focus on reinvestment was our students, was student success, was the academic enterprise. Different schools did it differently. Kennesaw State hired over 40 new full-time faculty, tenure track faculty that they targeted both to some new programs as well as to their core, and being able to make sure they can deliver their core on a timely basis. Another one of our institutions eliminated most of their course fees, right? So those are fees charged for specific courses. They said, we can fund this centrally now. We're eliminating that, which of course helps students as they, from an affordability sort of perspective. So that reinvestment was really key, because of course, you're a lot more motivated to save money if you can reinvest it in your campus than if it's going to be, pulled back centrally or something, which we did not do. One of the other areas that people could reinvest is into those administrative efficiencies. And so at the system office, we use most of our savings. We went through this at the system office as well. We invested most of that in supporting what we call the No More Borrow Less program, which is a combination kind of financial literacy as well as financial aid program to get students to borrow less money so that they come out with less debt. But we also reinvested that into some efforts. And one of those was the strategic implementation unit. And so this unit really pulled together the project management stuff that had been sitting in IT in terms of those activities, as well as some people that followed that. System integration, which was pulled out of kind of our shared services and our IT, as well as change management, which actually came out of an area that reported up to me at that time. And we built a new unit called strategic implementation. And so that unit is charged really going forward with project governance, project management, change management, system integration. Historically, that had all been the responsibility largely of our IT organization. And so, of course, our IT organization, vitally important, a big part of that, will continue to be a big part of that. But we said, it's the whole business needs to own major ERP implementations, and strategitic implementation has been kind of the tool we've used to do that. So I know I threw a lot of stuff out there, but I'm going to go ahead, and I know we'll have time for questions a little bit later. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Hicks to talk about that third area.
Thank you. And so I do want to circle back just a couple of points. I'd be remiss not to share that in the midst of the comprehensive administrative review, we were also going through, particularly with HR, a project called One USG, which was the centralization of all of our human capital management systems into one platform. And that has been the first platform that we share across all 26 institutions in the system office within the university system of Georgia, which I would say has been a Herculean effort, but good. But to do that with a layer of the comprehensive administrative review, there's a couple of points on there around looking for opportunities to create some additional efficiencies and share resources, which gets me into the Looking Forward initiative. We did find where there were opportunities, not just to change whether or not you were centralized or decentralized, but we all have to onboard our employees. And now that we're all operating within the same system and platform, there was an opportunity for us to look at doing that in a more centralized manner. And so now we've been able to implement that effort across all of our institutions, and we do so electronically, reducing some of the workload and expectation from our various HR units to collect, in many cases, all of that paper, which required people, time, and resources. And being able to do that, electronically has been greatly appreciated across our institutions. But looking at how we get things done made it much easier to implement such an effort, because we were able to identify quickly, these are the things that we do the same, and we focused our energy on where we had variation to determine whether or not that was necessary. So when looking forward to initiatives, we completed the One USG project right at the cusp of COVID. And as we moved to remote work, we decided Georgia Tech, which was the institution I had just come from, prior to being in the system office, was the last institution to implement. And we made a collective decision, we're going to forge ahead. And they did successfully so, bringing the project to completion from a benefits and payroll perspective. We're still working on talent acquisition and management. But the ability to have insight to our systems, implement new policies and structures to support remote work was tremendously helpful. And so now when we look forward to what is going to be our new future, we have the ability to do so from a shared system. If we have to implement changes, we're doing so for everyone at the same time versus having to coordinate in some ways 5 or 6 different systems that need to act the same, even though they're not within the same structure. So that also gives us opportunity to look at our employee pipeline. What do we need people to do in the future? And how is this going to work? In some ways, we've been able to reduce our populations where appropriate. That has not always, it happens in different ways. I think you all probably know that sometimes we look to do it through attrition. Sometimes it is a reduction in force. Sometimes it is shifting our resources from one area to another where appropriate. But being able to identify those opportunities collectively has been tremendously helpful. And through the HR community, we're able to share those ideas and thoughts as we plan for the future. Many of our institutions are having the conversation around organization structures and staffing to reflect our true business needs. So now that we have additional technology resources, standardization has been a term that we use on a regular basis. Are we doing things the same way and efficiently so? We're able to look at our organization needs from a different perspective, and we're able to react to that. Will we completely remain remote from here on out? I'm a true believer that that's a cyclical thing just within the workforce. Is that sometimes organizations move to remote, then they come back. I believe in a hybrid, personally, to find good balance in the two, because we do have to remember we're higher education and we serve a population that we have interactions with on a day-to-day basis, and ensuring that our faculty, from an administrative perspective, that our faculty have those connections, and so do our students, and finding good balance in that is really important. And that's the conversation that we are having across our institutions. But again, some of these early efforts prior to COVID and the needs from that perspective helped us to be successful, and will also color our decisions moving forward, and I think really open our eyes to looking at life differently.
Thank you both so much for those great examples. Much appreciated. I'll turn to one more case before we move through a few other items and then open it up for questions. And I'll move through this one very quickly, but I did want to offer another example an efficiency engagement that Huron worked on, where we've seen some very clear results on the mission and the academic side, very tangible. So just as a little bit of background, this was a pretty large institution, a $1 billion budget research institution that had been running an operating deficit of about $15 to $20 million for several years. And this was just limiting their ability to remain competitive and invest in the types of academic and other programs that their peers were doing. And also, leaving their infrastructure in really dire condition in some instances. So Huron was engaged to help them identify resources that they could use to address those competitive challenges, and for further investment in strategic initiatives. So we took a very comprehensive approach here. We're asked to leave no stone unturned, consider no cows too sacred to be examined. And ultimately, we identified about 75 discrete opportunities either to reduce costs or grow revenues. The institution selected 15 of those as highest priority, and the financial impact of those totaled about $30 million. And these were nothing too transformational, but it was real dollars. So it was implementing better procurement practices and getting better pricing, and also controlling individual spend, and ensuring that there were standard services and goods to purchase, and that there wasn't rogue spend and things like that. That was a several $1 million opportunity that really didn't result in any kind of challenges politically or other sensitivities that personnel facing opportunities often might. We did look at centralizing services, similar to some of the areas that were mentioned in the Georgia examples. We also assisted with careful unit by unit restructuring. Were administrative offices equitably staffed across the whole institution, where there were haves and have-nots? Could we get areas more aligned, and what might the dollar savings look like there? We also helped them stand up a new budget model to actually create incentives for deans and other leaders to grow resources and to be better stewards of the institution's resources. And then there were also several revenue growth opportunities as well. But the focus there was standing them up and executing them with existing resources to really improve that margin. So we helped design implementation roadmaps, then actually implement all 15 of these prioritized opportunities. Fast forward a couple years out from the engagement, the institution had eliminated its operating deficit, and it had used those resources to invest in academics, research, financial aid, infrastructure, and other mission priorities. The top right box in this slide has a quote from that university president that was emailed to my boss. It's a project that I'm particularly proud of, but mentioning that those resources were used for investment in the mission, and that they had a record year, not only financially, but in terms of admissions, rankings, and fundraising. So really just want to drive home the point that these types of exercises, reducing costs from core administrative services, are all about enhancing the mission of the institution at the end of the day. So I have one other poll question kind of related to that point, and it is, do you believe, given where things are at today, that an efficiency initiative or multiple initiatives will be needed to strengthen the financial and competitive position of your institution? I suspected that might be the case. Overwhelmingly, yes, in response to that question, and certainly aligns with exactly what we're seeing across the industry right now. Given all those competitive pressures I mentioned at the top of the session, and given the increasing pressures that were introduced by COVID, with few exceptions, looking to free up resources through these types of initiatives is going to be increasingly critical in remaining competitive and continuing to deliver great outcomes for students and other constituencies. Okay, so very quickly, I just want to mention some thoughts on how to actually execute these initiatives. And we often hear leaders talk about building the airplane as we fly it, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it does sort of convey the sense of urgency, the lack of resources, and the uncertainty that surround the current state and competitive challenges of higher education, and the need to address them. So while many university business officers may be ready for really transformative change, others may have to consider more incremental change, and that's okay. So we'd suggest first and foremost, just get the parts to do this. Identify what's feasible, and assign ownership for those types of projects, and assign it publicly and hold people accountable. Be clear about decision authority, who's going to own the projects, who's going to make decisions, who's going to hold responsibility for execution. And then, for all the folks who are going to be impacted by these types of initiatives, and also those who are going to assist in gathering data, providing information, anything needed to help drive them forward, you want to make sure you're sharing common real-time information and data with them, and establishing good, consistent communication channels. When there's a lack of transparency behind these initiatives, that's when they can collapse and fail, because people feel like big transformative changes are happening in closed door meetings. And ultimately, it's boots on the ground who live through this and are going to experience it and be impacted by it. So that's all to say, there can be incremental change. It doesn't have to be all holistic at once. But at the same time, you need to begin, quote unquote, flying the plane at some point. You don't want to get bogged down in too much front end analysis, hemming and hawing about how to get something exactly 100% perfectly right. You do need to strike a balance of preparation and execution, and being very thoughtful about how you implement and stand up these changes. And the last point on the actual execution and flying the plane, so to speak, is it's critical to celebrate successes, even minor successes along the way. Remind people why we're doing this. Remind folks what it's going to support in terms of long-term success for the institution, and the change that it actually affects as it stood up. And again, those can be minor. It can be a new procurement policy that was put in place that's going to reduce spend on travel and save a couple $100,000 a year. Those are scholarship resources that weren't available last year. Anything like that ought to be celebrated and communicated. And I just want to kind of reiterate that point because I think it's really important. So just before we open it up for questions, one last housekeeping item. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks to everyone who has been joining the previous sessions of this series. There are two left. The one that's going to be 2 weeks from today on April 28th is around enrollment management and strategy. And then the session in early May will be on ensuring community colleges emerge stronger, what we're seeing those institutions do faced by very unique pressures in the pandemic environment. So looking forward to those sessions as well. And with that, I am happy to open it up for Q&A, either for myself or for our colleagues from the University System of Florida.
Thank you, Chris. While some of our attendees are gathering their thoughts, we did have one question come in. Some of the numbers that you used early on in the presentation are much more than what some of the schools have budgeted for. So what suggestions do you have on scaling these conversations and initiatives down to an institution of about 2,000 students and 500 employees? Sometimes they might have an office of just one person.
Appreciate the question. And I'll mention that while the examples I posed did often focus on larger institutions, we see colleges and universities of all sizes undertaking these efforts. And while you may not get the types of personnel savings from some of these initiatives that were discussed today, there are certainly other opportunities, and they can be on the cost side or the revenue side. So one institution we engaged with that comes to mind was a small liberal arts college in the South, and they had been facing an operating deficit, and we were asked to help them address it. And our diagnostic, the first few weeks we were on campus, really trying to understand the current state, quickly revealed that they were operating about as leanly as they could from an administrative perspective. And that may sometimes be the case. That said, they had big opportunities with respect to procurement. There were other colleges in the region that were facing similar financial pressures, and they were able to partner with them to form, effectively an informal consortia to get better pricing on goods and services. That translated to real dollars that those institutions could use to invest. We also looked on the revenue side. And I know that's not specific to efficiency initiatives, but there were some real opportunities to tap into other markets that the smaller institution hadn't really considered. There was a growing professional population in the region, and there was capacity to stand up things like certificate programs and professional credentials to generate margin for the institution that could be invested in other academic programs and sort of the traditional undergraduate experience. So that's all to say, while the opportunities may not be as material dollar-wise at smaller institutions, I think on a percentage basis, they still exist. And I think oftentimes they can be tapped into. And there are certainly creative options as well for those institutions. And we're seeing, to my last point, really interesting, creative conversations happening much more frequently these days about how can regional institutions partner with one another to provide back office services. That is certainly an area that we expect to see a lot more activity in the coming years, which would benefit any institution that participated in one of those types of consortia that I mentioned.
I would just like to add that even though I do recognize we're a large public system, that we do have many institutions that are very small, similar in size to the question and the demographics of this institution. And so the comprehensive administrative review in some ways never went away. It's a continual conversation, and part of my role, we do have regular discussions with our institutions and others within the system office, because we still have that issue of it's a one-person team and there's no bench strength. And so how can we, either through a regional approach, but even then, that's not always feasible for our institutions. So we still have to look at how can this get done within the institution, and taking a step back to say, okay, well, are there teams and groups of people that you can blend together because it functionally makes sense to create a more robust team versus having just an office of one? And then asking the continued question, I had this conversation last week with someone of, I have more than I can get done. Okay, well, tell me what it is that you're doing and why you're doing those things. So it's the regular conversation of that activities assessment and making sure that we are working on what's important and we have our priorities aligned. And you may already be doing that, but sometimes that's also a part of the conversation that needs to be had on a regular basis to look for those opportunities.
Yeah, and I was going to add to that, and just to put some numbers around what Juanita just said, we have 26 institutions in our system. 9 of them have fewer than 4,000 students, and we have a handful that are similar to the size that was mentioned, 2,000 students. I want to speak to the dynamic of maybe one that wasn't specifically referenced, but the idea of kind of how do you bring truth to the discussion, or how do you bring a little bit of accountability to the discussion, right? So the fact that you're a smaller institution, honestly, you're going to have similar opportunities and similar challenges. They're just going to be sized to your institution. some of the tendencies towards silos is not peculiar to large schools, even though it's probably easier to do if you have a lot of resources. What is helpful that's being part of a system is, and I think part of our approach was having some outside partners that the institution was able to come back to, and there was some opportunity to ask frankly difficult questions to say, well, why is this way, or why is this that way? And that can be hard to do in a smaller school when everybody knows everybody else, and perhaps the community. There's a lot of outside, friendships and partnerships and so on. So I would suggest that part of this is really about having some sort of external accountability, whether that's to your board, a committee of your board, bring in an outside partner, an outside firm to help with it. But that actually is where I think you have probably have some opportunity. And I can tell you at those institutions that are very similar in size to yours, we had savings and we had positions, particularly at the senior level, actually, that where we're able to make some changes. So it was less what we'll call rank and file type roles, and more some of the senior roles where we had some of those opportunities.
Great, thank you. And we have just a few minutes left, so I'd like to sneak in one more question if I could. It would be interesting to know how the outcomes of our previous sessions related to the academic program strategies to add efficiencies, cost savings, and or increased revenue. Is there any work that has been done on that?
It's a great question. And I'd say, more and more frequently, we are seeing institutions sort of do both at once. So is our administrative structure structured appropriately to efficiently support delivery of our academic portfolio? And does our academic portfolio, is it rational? Does it align with student demand? Are we overinvested in any areas? Are we underinvested in any areas? The idea is that both are intended to provide resources for investment in sort of the highest priority strategic areas. So you may recall, for those who attended the last session, an academic portfolio review is not intended to say that the programs that generate the least margin or are most costly to the institution should cease to be in the portfolio. What it's intended to do is provide the information for academic leaders and others to say, is this subsidized appropriately? Is this subsidized too heavily? And it might be the fact that a costly program is really important to the mission of the institution, is really closely aligned with the brand and the competitive strength of the institution. And in that instance, it may need further investment. So that's where we would see an administrative review tie into the academic portfolio review and say, well, if we can centralize our HR function and save $2 million a year, we can hire another faculty member for that under-resourced program, which is going to be critical to our long-term success and our strategy. So we very much see the two linked. And more frequently see institutions conducting both assessments concurrently, administrative and academic.
And I'm going to put on another hat for a minute because I had the opportunity to lead the last 3 campus consolidation efforts from the system office level and what we did there. And of course, a lot of it was very driven at the campus level. But I will say that in each of those, the institutions, the merged institutions, did look at academic programs, and there were opportunities to, in some cases, they added academic programs as a part of their review. In other cases, they kind of had to merge academic programs, if you will, because of course, if you're a business school, for example, you can't have 2 separate MBAs. You got to have 1 MBA. And so, in the context of looking at all of that, those institutions were able to recognize some savings administratively, of course, through consolidation, but they also, as a part of that, were often able to expand the offerings, the academic offerings to students. And all of that was done at a net cost that was ultimately less you know, there are less dollars out the door, fewer dollars out the door. And I know there's been some academic work done around this, but there was ultimately improved retention, progression, and graduation rates following on from that. So not maybe directly related to just, you know, normalization of kind of your academic programs, but I do think some of the stuff we saw in consolidation, we dealt with some of those dynamics, and there were some good outcomes.
Great. That was the last question that we had. I will pass it back to Dr. Lawrence if you have any last remarks.
Sure, I don't have any remaining remarks. I just like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And with that, look forward to you potentially joining us for the next session coming up later this month. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We will see you soon. Bye-bye.